All right, welcome back. We are now going to continue with Chapter 10, Religion and Reform. We're going to talk about Section 3 and 4 here. And Section 3 is going to talk about the Atlantic origins of the Reform movements. Now, the Reform movements that emerged in the United States during the first half of the 19th century were not necessarily American inventions. Instead, these movements were really rooted in transatlantic world where both sides of the oceans faced similar problems, and together they collaborated to find similar solutions. Many of the same factors that spurred American reformers to action, such as urbanization, industrialization, and class struggle, equally affected Europe. Reformers on both sides of the Atlantic visited and corresponded with one another, exchanging ideas and building networks proving to be crucial to sharing the causes like abolition and women's rights. Improvements in transportation, including the introduction of the steamboat, canals, railroads, these connected people not just across the United States, but also with other like-minded reformers in Europe. Ironically, the same technologies that helped ensure that these people were connected also ensured that, even after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, the British remained heavily invested in slavery, either directly or indirectly from the United States. Equally important, the reduction of publication costs created by new printing technologies in the 1830s allowed reformers to reach new audiences across the world. Almost immediately after its publication, the United States, for instance, the escaped slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass had his autobiography republished in Europe and translated into French and Dutch, which galvanized Douglass's supporters across the Atlantic. Such exchanges began as part of the larger processes of colonization and empire building. Missionary organizations from colonial era had created many of these transatlantic links. The Atlantic travel of major figures during the First Great Awakening, such as George Whitefield, had built really kind of enduring networks. And these networks changed as a result of the American Revolution, but still revealed spiritual and personal connections between religious individuals and organizations in the United States and Great Britain. These connections can be seen in multiple areas. Mission work continued to be a joint effort, with American and European missionary societies working in close correspondence throughout the early 19th century. As they coordinated domestic and foreign evangelistic missions, the transportation and print revolutions also meant that news of British missionary efforts in places like India and Tahiti could be quickly printed in American religious periodicals, galvanizing American efforts to evangelize Native Americans, frontier settlers, immigrant groups, and even people overseas. In addition to missions, anti-slavery work had decidedly transatlantic beginnings. American Quakers began to question slavery as early as the late 17th century and worked with British reformers in the successful campaigns that ended the slave trade. Before, during, and after the Revolution, many Americans continued to admire European thinkers. Influence extended both east and west. By foregrounding questions about rights, the American Revolution helped inspire British abolitionists, who in turn offered support to their American counterparts. American anti-slavery activists developed close relationships with abolitionists on the other side of the Atlantic, such as Thomas Clarkson, Daniel O'Connell, and Joseph Sturge. Prominent American abolitionists such as Theodore Dwight Weld, Lucretia Mott, and William Lloyd Garrison were converted to the anti-slavery idea of immediatism, that is, the demand for emancipation without delay, by British abolitionists Elizabeth Hayrick and Charles Stewart. Although Anglo-American anti-slavery networks reached back to the late 18th century, they dramatically grew in support and strength over the antebellum period, as evidenced by the General Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. This anti-slavery delegation consisted of more than 500 abolitionists, mostly coming from France, England, and the United States. They all met together in England, united by their common goal of ending slavery in their time. Although abolitionism was not the largest American reform movement of the antebellum period, that honor belonged to the temperance movement. It did foster great cooperation among the reformers in England and the United States. In the course of their abolitionist activities, many American women began to establish contact with their counterparts across the Atlantic, each group penning articles and contributing material support to the other's anti-slavery publications and fundraisers. The bonds between British and American reformers can really be traced throughout many social improvement projects of the 19th century. transatlantic cooperation galvanized efforts to reform individuals' and society's relationship to alcohol, labor, religion, education, commerce, and even land ownership. This cooperation stemmed from the recognition that social problems on both sides of the Atlantic were strikingly similar. Atlantic activists helped the American reformers conceptualize themselves as part of a worldwide moral mission to attack the social ills and spread the gospel of Christianity. Now, attacking these social ills and spreading Christianity will bring us here to Section 4, the Benevolent Empire. After religious disestablishment, citizens of the United States really faced a dilemma. How exactly do we cultivate a moral and virtuous public without aid from state-sponsored religion? Now, most Americans agreed that a good and moral citizenry was essential for the national projects to succeed, but many shared the perception that society's moral foundation was weakening. Narratives of moral and social decline, known as Jeremiads, long had been embedded in the Protestant storytelling traditions, but they took on new urgency in the antebellum period. In the years immediately following disestablishment, traditional Protestant Christianity was at a low tide, while the Industrial Revolution and the spread of capitalism had led to a host of social problems associated with cities and commerce. The Second Great Awakening was in part a spiritual response to such changes, revitalizing Christian spirits through the promise of salvation. The revivals also provided an institutional antidote to the insecurities of a rapidly changing world by inspiring an immense and widespread movement for social reform. Growing directly out of the 19th century revivalism, reform societies proliferated throughout the United States between 1815 and 1861, melding religion and reform into a powerful force in American culture, known as the Benevolent Empire. Now, the Benevolent Empire departed from revivalism's early populism as middle-class ministers dominated the leadership of antebellum reform societies. Because of the economic forces of the market revolution, middle-class evangelicals had the time and resources to devote to reform campaigns. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to remember that while their reforms focused on creating and maintaining respectable middle-class culture throughout the United States, middle-class women in particular played a leading role in reform activity. How did they do that? Well, they became increasingly responsible for the moral maintenance of their homes and communities, and their leadership signaled a dramatic departure from the previous generations, when such prominent roles for ordinary women would have been unthinkable. Now, different forces within the evangelical Protestantism combined to encourage reform. One of the great lights of the benevolent reform was Charles Grandison Feeney, the radical revivalist who promoted a movement known as perfectionism. Premised on the belief that truly redeemed Christians would be motivated to live free of sin and reflect the perfection of God himself, his wildly popular revivals encouraged his converted followers to join reform movements and create God's kingdom on earth. This idea of disinterested benevolence also turned many evangelicals towards reform. Now, understand what disinterested benevolence actually was for quiz purposes. Because preachers championing this disinterested benevolence argued that true Christianity required a person to give up self-love in favor of loving others. That's nice. Though perfectionism and disinterested benevolence were the most prominent forces encouraging benevolent societies, some preachers achieved the same end in their advocacy of postmillennialism. In this worldview, Christ's return was foretold to occur after humanity had enjoyed 1,000 years of peace, and it was the duty of converted Christians to improve the world around them in order to pave the way for Christ's redeeming return. Though ideological and theological issues like these divided Protestants into more and more sects, church leaders often worked on interdenominational basis to establish benevolent societies and draw their followers into the work of social reform. Under the leadership of preachers and ministers, reform societies attacked many social problems. Those concerned about drinking could join temperance societies. Other groups focused on eradicating dueling and gambling. Evangelical reformers might support home or foreign missionaries or Bible or tract societies. Sabbatarians fought tirelessly to end non-religious activity on the Sabbath. Moral reform societies sought to end prostitution and redeem fallen women. Over the course of the antebellum period, voluntary associations and benevolent activists also worked to reform bankruptcy laws, prison systems, insane asylums, labor laws, and education. They built orphanages and free medical dispensaries and developed programs to provide professional services like social work, job placement, and even day camps for children in the slums. These organizations often shared memberships, as individuals found themselves interested in a wide range of reform movements. On Anniversary Week, many major reform groups coordinated the schedules of their annual meetings in New York or Boston to allow individuals to attend multiple meetings in a single trip. Among all the social reform movements associated with the Benevolent Empire, the Temperance Crusade was the most successful. Championed by prominent preachers like Lyman Beecher, the movement's effort to curb the consumption of alcohol galvanized widespread support among the middle class. Alcohol consumption became a significant social issue during the American Revolution, and particularly after it as well. Commercial distilleries produced readily available, cheap whiskey that was frequently more affordable than milk or beer, or in reality, it was also safer than water. And hard liquor became a staple beverage in many low and middle class households. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to understand, consumption of alcohol among adults skyrocketed in the early 19th century, and alcoholism had become an endemic problem across the United States by the 1820s. As alcoholism increasingly became a visual issue in towns and cities, most reformers escalated their efforts from advocating moderation in liquor consumption to full abstinence from alcohol. Many reformers saw intemperance as the biggest impediment to maintaining order and morality in the young republic. Temperance reformers saw a direct correlation between alcohol and other forms of vice, and most importantly, they felt it endangered family life. In 1826, evangelical ministers organized the American Temperance Society to help spread the crusade nationally. It supported lecture campaigns, produced temperance literature, and organized revivals specifically aimed at encouraging worshipers to give up the drink. It was so successful that within a decade, it established 5,000 branches and grew to over 1 million members. Temperance reformers pledged not to touch the bottle and canvassed their neighborhoods and towns to encourage others to join their cold water army. They also influenced lawmakers in several states to prohibit the sale of liquor. In response to the perception that heavy drinking was associated with men who abused or abandoned or neglected their family obligations, women formed a significant presence in societies dedicated to eradicating liquor. Temperance became a hallmark of middle-class respectability among both men and women, and developed into a crusade with visible class character. Temperance, like many other reform efforts, was championed by middle class and threatened to intrude on the private lives of lower class workers, many of whom were Irish Catholics. Such intrusions by the Protestant middle class exacerbated class, ethnic, and religious tensions. Still, while the temperance movement made less substantial inroads in lower class working drinking culture, the movement was a great success for reformers. In the 1840s, Americans drank half of what they had in the 1820s, and per capita consumption continued to decline over the next 2 decades. Though middle-class reformers worked tirelessly to cure all manners of social problems through institutional salvation and voluntary benevolent work, they regularly participated in religious organizations founded explicitly to address the spiritual mission at the core of evangelical Protestantism. In fact, for many reformers, it was actually the experience of evangelizing among the poor and seeing firsthand the rampant social issues plaguing life in the slums that really first inspired them to get involved with the benevolent reform projects to begin with. Modeling themselves on the British and Foreign Bible Society formed in 1804 to spread Christian doctrine to the British working class, urban missionaries emphasized the importance of winning the world for Christ, one soul at a time. For example, the American Bible Society and American Tract Society used efficient new steam-powered printing presses to distribute Bibles and evangelizing religious tracts throughout the United States. For example, the New York Religious Tract Society alone managed to distribute religious tracts to all but 388 of New York City's 28,383 families. In Places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, middle-class women also established groups specifically to canvass neighborhoods and bring the gospel to lower-class wards. Such evangelical missions extended well beyond the urban landscape, however. Stirred by nationalism and moral purpose, the evangelicals labored to make sure that the Word of God reached far-flung settlers on the new American frontier. The American Bible Society distributed thousands of Bibles to the frontier areas where churches and clergy were scarce, while the American Home Missionary Society provided substantial financial assistance to the frontier congregations struggling to achieve self-sufficiency. Missionaries worked to translate the Bible into Iroquois and other languages in order to more effectively evangelize Native American populations. As efficient printing technology and faster transportation facilitated new transatlantic and global connections, religious Americans also began to flex their missionary zeal on the global stage. In 1810, for example, Presbyterian and Congregationalist leaders established the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to evangelize India, Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific. The potent combination of social reform and evangelical mission at the heart of the 19th century's benevolent empire produced reform agendas and institutional changes that have reverberated through the 20th and 21st centuries. By devoting their time to the moral uplift of their communities and the world at large, middle-class reformers created many of the largest and most influential organizations in the nation's history. For the optimistic, religiously motivated Americans, no problem seemed too great to solve. Difficulties arose, however, when the benevolent empire attempted to take up more explicitly political issues. The movement against Indian removal was the first major example of this. Missionary work had first brought the Cherokee Nation to the attention of the Northeastern evangelicals in the early 19th century. Missionaries led by the American Board and other groups sought to introduce Christianity and American cultural values to the Cherokee and celebrated when their efforts seemed to be met with success. Evangelicals proclaimed that the Cherokee were becoming civilized, which could be seen in their adoption of written language and a constitution modeled on that of the U.S. government. Mission supporters were shocked when the election of Andrew Jackson brought a new emphasis on the removal of Native Americans from the land east of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was met with fierce opposition from within the effective Native American communities, as well as the Benevolent Empire. Jeremiah Evarts, one of the leaders of the American Board, wrote a series of essays under the pen name William Penn, urging Americans to oppose removal. He used the religious and moral arguments of the mission movement, but added a new layer of politics in his extensive discussion of the history of the United States and Native Americans. This political shift was even more evident when American missionaries challenged Georgia state laws asserting sovereignty over Cherokee territory in the Supreme Court case, Worcester versus Georgia. Although the case was successful, the federal government did not enforce the court's decision, and the Indian removal was accomplished through the Trail of Tears, the tragic forced removal of Native Americans to territories west of the Mississippi, like Oklahoma. That's why they were crying, because Oklahoma sucks. Anti-removal activism was also notable for the entry of ordinary women into the political discourse. The first major petition campaign by American women focused on opposition to removal and was led anonymously by Catherine Beecher. Beecher was already a leader in the movement to reform women's education and came to her role in removal through her connections to the mission movement. Inspired by a meeting with Jeremiah Evarts, Beecher echoed his arguments from the William Penn letters in her appeal to American women. Beecher called on women to petition the government to end the policy of Indian removal. She used religious and moral arguments to justify women's entry into the political discussion when it concerned an obviously moral cause. This effort was ultimately unsuccessful, but still introduced the kinds of arguments that paved the way for women's political activism, for abolitionism, and women's rights. The division that the anti-removal campaign revealed became more dramatic with the next political case of the 19th century reformers, abolitionism.